Hello there. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the joints of the lower limbs. So we've already covered the joints of the upper limb, the bones of the upper and lower limbs. We've also covered the axial skeleton, the trunk and the skull. Let's give it a minute here. Yep, the trunk and the skull. We've mentioned them. We've already covered all of this, joints between them. The only thing left to finish the skeletal system, apart from the skull, is joints of the lower limb. So let's get started. So the joints of the lower limb, it's also divided into two parts among itself: the articulations of the griddle and the articulations of the free bones. So what the griddle is, basically, like I've mentioned before, the griddle, we know here is the axial skeleton. The griddle is the part that touches the axial skeleton. So it should be this, the joint in here, and all the ligaments that support the joint. So let's have a look at the articulations of the griddle. The first joint we need to mention is the sacroiliac joint. So by the name, I could guess what that is. Sacroiliac. So sacro comes from the sacrum. We know that this bone here is called the sacrum. So sacro and iliac. So we also know that this part of the hip bone is called the iliac part. So sacroiliac joint should be the joint between the sacrum and the iliac part. Let's have a look. Yes, I'm very correct. Here is the sacrum, here's the iliac, and here's the sacroiliac joint. And there are actually a bunch of ligaments supporting the sacroiliac joints, which we'll be covering in here. Ligaments between the hip bone and the spinal column. So let's have a look at them. So sacroiliac joint done. Ligaments between hip bone and spinal column. There are a bunch of ligaments here. It looks very complicated, but let's simplify it bit by bit. So the first ligament we want to talk about is the iliolumboral ligament. So the iliolumboral ligament, again, by the name, I don't want to just open into it. By the name, I could guess ilio, I would guess ilio, iliac, lumboral vertebrae. So iliolumboral would be the ligament between the iliac and the lumbar vertebrae. So let's have a look. Yes, it's this ligament in here, iliolumboral ligament. It's the ligament between the lumboral, the transverse process of the lumboral ligament, the lumboral vertebrae, and the iliac part of the bone. Yes. Okay, next up we have the sacrospinosus ligament. Let's have a look at what that is. Sacrospinosus ligament. Here's the sacrospinosus ligament. Here's the spinosus of the hip bone, and here's the sacrum. Sacrospinosus ligament would be between the spine of the hip bone and the sacrum. Very simple. Let's move on. Next up, we have the sacrotuberous ligament. Sacrotuberous. It is this ligament in here. I actually don't know what the tuberous stands for in here, but I know that sacro stands for the sacrum. So I would guess that it comes out of the sacrum and goes somewhere. And apparently, this somewhere is this part here with the pubis part of the hip bone. Next up, we have the sacrococcygeal ligament. If you have a look in here, there is ligaments between the sacrum. Here's the sacrum. This is a view from the back. So this is a posterior view. So here's the sacrum, and under it is the coccyx. So we have here the deep dorsal saxo-occygeal ligament, and I could guess if there is deep dorsal, I could guess that there's a superficial dorsal sacro-occygeal ligament. Very correct here. Superficial dorsal sacro-occygeal ligament. So the deep is the one inside, the superficial is the one outside. Superficial is basically outside, and deep is deep. Very simple. So actually, let's have a look at what I have in here. Not this. Here, sacro-occygeal ligament. Yes, here we have the deep, and here we have the superficial dorsal sacro-occygeal ligament. It sounds very complicated, but it's very simple. We have the sacrum, the coccyx, sacro-coccygeal ligament. Very simple. All right. Next up, we have the pubic ligament. So I actually didn't mention it because we'll be talking about it somewhere in here in the pubic symphysis. So let's have a look at the pubic symphysis. Let's close this. Here, what this pubic symphysis is basically this piece of ligament, I'll say, a piece of cartilage. I don't know what it really consists of, that connects the two pubis. So here we have one pubis, two pubises? The plural of pubis, I do not know what that is. Anyways, pubis, and we here have the pubic symphysis between them. Very simple. Something we need to mention is, we'll actually mention it later, but we need to mention the ligaments that support the pubic symphysis. We have the superior pubis ligament, the inferior pubis ligament. Very simple. All right, next up, we need to talk about the pelvis. What the pelvis is basically that hole that in here that is between basically the two hip bones, so this hole in here. And actually there are two different parts of pelvises. We have a true pelvis, which is the actual hole. It's true, so that's why it's a true pelvis. also called the lesser pelvis. We also have the greater or the false pelvis. Why is it false? Because it's not an actual hole. It's just this part of the hole. So it's called the greater pelvis, the lesser pelvis, and actually this line that aligns the interior of the hip bone is called the pelvic brim. So this pelvic brim in here. And here's another look at it from an x-ray. Here we have the pubic symphysis. We also have the pubis, this part. Here's the ilium, ischium. Those are all parts of the hip bone. Very simple. We need to keep track of what I'm saying in here. Sacroiliac joint, the joint between the sacrum and the iliac and the ilium. I've already mentioned that up there. And yeah, very simple. Last thing I need to mention before moving into the articulation of the free bones is the subpubic angle. So what is a subpubic angle? You see, here is the pubis, and between the two pubises, there is an angle in here called the subpubic angle, and this angle actually differs between the male and the female. As in the female, the subpubic angle is actually wider than the male subpubic angle. So this is something to keep in mind, very interesting to look at. All right, so by that we end the articulation of the griddle of the lower limb. Now let's talk about the articulations of the free bones of the lower limb. So let's have a look. So this is very straightforward to keep track with. We have the hip joint, the joint between the hip bone and the femur. We have the knee joint, the joint between the femur and the tibia and fibula, and we have the articulations between the tibia and fibula, and also we have the joints of the foot. So let's get started. Hip joint, number one. I have a bunch of picture of the hip joint here because the hip joint is actually very simple to understand, but there are a bunch of ligaments that you need to keep track of. So we have it's basically a ball and socket kind of joint, and here we have a cavity of the joint, so there's an empty space between them, and if this cavity actually is not there, a bunch of problems happen. It's very painful, and yeah, so we have the cavity between them, and it just looks like this. And if you look at the ligaments that surround them, we have the iliofemoral ligament by the name ilium, femoral, femur bone. So iliofemoral ligament, here we have one. We also have another one here, the ischiofemoral ligament. So in this starts the ischium and the femoral and the femur. So ischiofemoral ligament, the ligament between the ischium and the femur bone. Very simple stuff. And just a bunch of other ligaments that are not related really to the joint. We have here a tendon. So what the tendon is basically the start of a muscle. Yeah, very interesting stuff. I actually love this picture a lot because it shows like a lot of complications, but it's actually very simple if you look at it bit by bit. It's just here we have fat, we have muscles, we have bones, ligaments are in white. Very simple stuff. All right. Oh, here's something I need to mention is the joint cavity, so the space between the joint, like I've mentioned up there. Very simple stuff. All right, let's close the hip joint and let's have a look at the knee joint. So the knee joint seems very complicated, but it's actually pretty simple in my opinion. And here we have the patella bone. So like I've mentioned before, the patella bone is a bone you touch when you touch your knees. It's that bone in front, and the bone is kept in place with the help of two ligaments. We have the patellar ligament in here. This ligament is called the patellar ligament. Here's another picture of it cut, and it just basically keeps the patella in place. We also have here we have muscles, and here we have the tendon of quadriceps femoris muscle. So this is a tendon of this muscle, and yeah, it also helps keep the patella in place. Very simple, but very interesting. Here's another picture of the knee joint, but without the patella bone. So here we don't have a patella bone. Here's a patellar ligament, and the patella bone would be patella bone would be somewhere in here. We have also the anterior cruciate ligament. So it's called cruciate because it looks like a cruciate, like it looks like a, what's it called? Yeah, it's just cruciate. We have the posterior cruciate ligament, so we have two, the anterior and the posterior, and those are two ligaments that are in the middle of the joint. And actually, if we look at this, if we and look at it from top down, here's the back of knee, like I said. Here's the back. Here's an anterior view of it. We have the patellar ligament, so this is the front patellar ligament, the front, and here's the back. And here we have the lateral meniscus, and it just this and this that help keep the femur bone on top of it, on top of the tibia and the fibular that is actually down there. And also, of course, we have cavities. Here's a knee capsule, and we have cavities in here. Here, suprapatellar bursa. Bursa is basically a cavity. It's just nothing in there, and it also helps keep everything in place, provide more flexibility. We have the superficial interpatellar bursa. We have the deep interpatellar bursa, just basically 1, 2, like I said, bursa, just empty spaces. Here we have another bursa in here. And here's another picture of the knee under the X-ray view. And those are the important ligaments, patellar tendon. Here, it should be patellar ligament, actually. I don't know why it's called tendon in here. The quadricep tendon, yeah, this is correct. We have the medial collateral ligament on the side. Of course, we have the lateral collateral ligament on the other side. So those are all very simple ligaments, but you need to keep in mind. So next up, we have the articulations between tibia and fibula. This part is the simplest part. It's just a bunch of ligaments that connect the tibia to the fibula. Very simple stuff. We have the intertarsal membrane. Just boom, 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 boom. This membrane in here. Very simple. I'm not going to talk about it much. We have also, something we need to keep in mind is that we have here a joint in here called the superior tibiofibular joint. Tibia, fibula bone. So superior tibiofibular joint. And actually, we have a superior tibiofibular joint. I could guess that there's an inferior tibiofibular joint. Yep, inferior tibiofibular joint. So yeah, very simple stuff. All right, and anything else to keep in mind? No, that should be it. All right, next up we have the joints of the foot. Actually, this part took the most amount of work in order to understand it and to keep everything in mind. So let's have a look. Before we look into the joints, we need to actually have a quick review about the bones. So in here we have the fibula bone, the tibial bone. In here we have the talus bone. We have the calcaneus bone, calcaneus bone. Or called the heel bone. Here we have the cuneiforms, and we have one special called the cuboid bone. So all those names play a huge part in the naming of the joints, like I've mentioned a million times. And here we have the ankle joint. Ankle would be called the tibio-talar joint. And here we know that this is called the talus, and this is the tibula. Here, the big one is the tibula, talus. So the ankle would be also called the tibio-talar joint. We also have the talno-avicular joint. So talno-avicular joint is this joint in here between the talus and this bone in here. What else? Oh yeah, we have tarso-metatarsal joint. Very simple. Here, those are called the tarsals. Those bones in here, the cuboid and the cuneiforms, are called the tarsals, and those are the metatarsals. So tarso-metatarsal joint. This reminds me of the joints of the hands. Actually, remember we had the carpo-metacarpal joint. So those is something similar, but in here we have tarsal-metatarsal joint. We also have the metatarsal phalangeal joint. So those are the phalanges. Those are the metatarsals. We have 5 metatarsals. We have here a bunch of phalanges, and the joints between the phalanges and the metatarsals are called the metatarsophalangeal joint. So those joints in here, very simple stuff. Oh, we also have the subtalar joint. So here's the talus. Here's the subtalar joint, the joint under the talar, and actually I'll be talking about it in a second. We also have the calcaneocuboid joint. So by the name, this is a calcaneus. Here's a cuboid bone. So calcaneocuboid joint should be the joint between the calcaneus and the cuboid bone. Here's the cuboid, and the calcaneus is the heel bone somewhere in the back. So yeah. So actually, let's talk about the ankle joint first. So the ankle joint is this joint in here, also called the tibio-talar joint, and it has a bunch of ligaments listed in here that I wouldn't want to go over all of them, but it's a very important thing to look. Here's the ankle joint. If you cut it and you look at it from down up, so this is an inferior view of it, you could see that there's an inferior articular surface of tibula and the lateral metatarsal articular surface, so 1, 2, and there are a bunch of membranes that keep everything in place, like this one here, called the anterior tibiofibular ligament between the tibia and fibula. So this is a ligament in here, and there are a bunch of ligaments here also that keep the ligaments, the tibia and fibula tied up to the talus. For example, the posterior tibiofibular ligament, and those are all the same ligament. Yeah. So yeah, that should be this. So next up we have this is taking too long. Let's be faster a bit. Here we have the subtalar joint. It's just joint here, like I've mentioned, between it's the under the talus, so it's called the subtalar joint, and it's actually a little bit complicated because it has three different facets of the anterior, middle, and posterior facets, and those facets are basically where the bones touch each other, and those are all the ligaments that support this joint in here called the subtalar joint, like I've mentioned. So this is just a picture to keep in mind, just for later. Those are other joints that are actually I've came through them here. I've already covered them. And here's another view of the foot. If you look at it from the side, and those are all ligaments that you need to keep in mind. I'm not going to talk about the ligaments much. Just keep them in mind. Here's another view. This is very important to keep in mind as well. By the way, here the flanges are cut off, just the metatarsals, and they stop here. And those are all the ligaments, like I've mentioned, that are very important. And that's it. That should be it for the articulations of the free bones of the lower limb, and by that the joints of the lower limb. And next video we're talking about the bones and the joints of the skull, and that should be it for the skeletal system. So we can start talking about other more interesting systems, in my opinion. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope that was really helpful, and if you have any questions, just reach out.